In the last class, I talked about shared tenancy in Amazon EC2. This time, I will talk about dedicated hosts versus dedicated instances, and I will do it in the simplest way possible so you can understand it very well. So, a dedicated host on Amazon EC2 is a physical server dedicated entirely for your personal use. It is only yours and no one else. It's as simple as that. When we talk about dedicated host, it is very different from shared tenancy. Remember, with shared tenancy, you don't get to choose the specific physical server on which your EC2 instance runs. But with a dedicated host, you have that ability. So, a dedicated host has a virtualization layer in place, and you can run any virtual machine you want there. In this case, your instances. Think of it like if you had a server in your company running Windows Server and you run virtual machines with Hyper-V. Something like that would be the AWS dedicated host. Now, when choosing a dedicated host, remember that there are some real positive benefits and there is a downside to this. Firstly, the benefits. We're dealing with the fact that we have more accurate license management. Now, when it comes to this issue, what we're dealing with here is the fact that some software is licensed with a file attached to the hardware. And if you don't have the ability to stay on a fixed host, you don't have the ability to properly comply with those license agreements. Now, fortunately, many organizations have realized that that kind of licensing model is a very old way of thinking about where you deal with physical servers, and they've moved away from it. But there are some that are still there. And if you have to comply with that, a dedicated host may be your only option. An example of this is Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle. SQL Server licenses are purchased by CPU count and other factors and must be tied to the server hardware. And if you don't have a physical or dedicated server or host, this was not possible. Another pro of having a dedicated host would be to meet corporate compliance requirements. Some organizations need to run their instances on dedicated servers or hosts instead of multi-user or client servers. Dedicated hosts, therefore, provide visibility and the option to control how you place your instances on a specific physical server. This allows you to deploy instances using configurations that facilitate compliance with regulatory and enterprise compliance requirements. There are also other benefits or pros that I will mention in due course. Now, what about the downside? Well, the biggest downside we have is that it costs more. Amazon has to reserve that physical machine, that host for you. That can be quite expensive compared to shared tenancy. You should make sure you look at the pricing model before you make the decision to go to a dedicated host, especially if performance is your primary motivator. If it's about compliance, if it's about license management, that sort of thing, then you may not have a choice, and you may have to pay the additional cost. But if it's all about performance, you may be able to achieve that with shared tenancy using a different class rather than moving to a dedicated host. Now let's briefly talk about dedicated instances. Dedicated instances are Amazon EC2 instances running on hardware dedicated to a single customer. Your dedicated instances are physically isolated at the host hardware level from instances belonging to other AWS accounts. So, the dedicated instances can share hardware with other instances, but from the same AWS account, that is, you and no one else. So, it's about when you launch your EC2 instances, they're going to be hosted on a physical server where it's just going to be for you. But the difference is now how it's dedicated to a host. So, with a dedicated host, you have complete control over that host, and you know that if you launch an instance on that dedicated host, always that instance, even if you restart it, is going to stay on that same physical server. With dedicated instances, this doesn't happen. You're saying, okay, there's hardware that will be dedicated to me as a client, but my dedicated instances will be distributed across all the physical servers or hosts that are mine. And I'll never know which of those physical hosts or servers my dedicated instance is running on. Then, I may share the physical host with other instances that belong to me as a customer, and that's where the difference with dedicated instances and dedicated hosts comes in. So, on a dedicated host, I have absolute total control. That if I launch an EC2 instance, I know that it's always going to be on the same server or physical host that I'm managing. With a dedicated instance, I don't have control of the server or physical host on which I'm launching that instance. But still, both the dedicated host and the dedicated instances, they are only mine and nobody else's. No AWS customer can launch instances or run their workloads on my dedicated physical host or server. So, basically these would also be the advantages of having the dedicated instance versus a dedicated host. The other advantage would be being able to solve possible compliance issues that may exist with on-demand instances so that I don't have to go to the dedicated host level, which is more expensive. Now, drawbacks or disadvantages. Well, we have less precise license management than we have with a dedicated host because we don't necessarily have to lock our application to a specific host even though the host is specific to us. In other words, to put it clearly again, that's my physical host, but I may have multiple instances and I may have multiple physical hosts that are mine. And when I reboot an instance, it might start on one of my other physical hosts. I don't really have control over that. How I do with a dedicated host, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't allow for location determination. Therefore, and to conclude, in this table, we can summarize the difference between dedicated instances and dedicated hosts. Dedicated instances are billed per instance, unlike dedicated hosts, which are billed per host. In a dedicated host, you can have visibility of the number of sockets and physical cores, unlike dedicated instances that you cannot. On a dedicated host, it allows you to consistently deploy your instances on the same physical server over time, which I mentioned to you earlier. On dedicated instances is not allowed, and so, among other differences. So, this is all there is for now about this topic. See you next time.